Welcome to Dusk and Empires. Tonight, we follow the mule teams and weary families who floated 363 miles through the dark of New York, hauling the weight of a young nation while sleeping in shifts on wooden bunks barely wider than a shoulder. If this sounds like your kind of bedtime story, subscribe before you drift off. Now get comfortable, close your eyes, and let history carry you to sleep. Opening meditation. Close your eyes, if you haven't already. Let your shoulders settle. Let your hands rest open. There is nothing that needs your attention tonight, nothing that cannot wait until morning. Somewhere in the interior of a continent, there is a ribbon of still water. It stretches across the width of a great state, running west to east, through meadows and marshlands, through small sleeping towns and stands of ancient elm. The water is dark and quiet now. A single lantern drifts along it, orange and slow, reflected in the surface. That lantern belongs to a boat. And that boat belongs to a world that is almost entirely forgotten. Let your breathing slow. Let the world outside go quiet. We are already there. Part 1: The Dream in the Wilderness. There is something almost impossible to imagine about the state of New York in the year 1817. Not the New York of great bridges and towering glass. Not even the New York of gaslight and cobblestone. This is a New York of mud roads and ox carts, a forest so dense that travelers sometimes walked for days without seeing the sky. West of the Hudson River, the land fell away into a vast and largely unmapped interior, rolling hills, dark stands of beech and maple, swamps that swallowed horses whole, rivers that ran cold and fast and refused to be tamed. And yet someone looked at that wilderness and saw a highway. That person was not one person. It was many people, over many years. It was surveyors squinting through instruments in the rain. It was politicians arguing in poorly heated rooms. It was farmers and merchants and dreamers who understood, in a way that is hard to explain without knowing the era, that the young United States of America was at a crossroads, and that the road it needed most was made of water. To understand why the Erie Canal mattered so profoundly, you have to understand what it meant to move anything in America in the early 19th century. Moving goods overland was slow, expensive, and often ruinous. A horse-drawn wagon carrying a ton of cargo might cover 15 miles in a day on a good road, and good roads were a luxury that most of the interior did not have. The cost of transporting a ton of flour from western New York to the coast by road in 1817 was roughly $100, a sum that made western farming economically impossible for most settlers. What grew in the West largely stayed in the West, because the cost of getting it out was simply too high. The rivers helped, but only so much. Rivers ran where rivers ran. They flooded in spring and ran low in drought. They tumbled over waterfalls and ground through gorges that no boat could navigate safely. The great dream of American expansion, the belief that the interior of the continent could be settled, farmed, and connected to the markets of the eastern seaboard, was stalled, effectively, by geography. Governor DeWitt Clinton of New York understood this. He understood it with the particular clarity of a man who had grown up watching his city's fortunes ebb and flow with the tides of commerce. New York City was already a great port, but its hinterland was limited. Boston, Philadelphia, Baltimore, all of them had access to rich inland territory. New York's natural waterway, the Hudson River, reached north and west, but only so far. What if, Clinton asked, a canal could be cut across the state of New York, connecting the Hudson River at Albany to the Great Lakes at Buffalo? The idea had been proposed before by various engineers and visionaries going back to the 1790s. George Washington himself had championed the idea of connecting the eastern seaboard to the Ohio River Valley through a series of canals. But Clinton, stubborn and brilliant and deeply invested in the dream, pushed harder than anyone before him. The canal would have to be 363 miles long, longer than any canal ever built in the Western Hemisphere. It would require 83 locks to manage an elevation change of more than 500 feet between the Hudson and Lake Erie. It would cross rivers, swamps, and hard rock ridges. It would need to be built through territory that was, in many places, barely surveyed, let alone settled. And it would have to be built almost entirely by hand. When President James Madison declined to fund the project from federal funds, citing constitutional concerns about such internal improvements, Clinton turned to the state of New York. He made his case with passion and precision. He argued that the canal would transform not just New York but the entire nation, that it would open the vast agricultural wealth of the Great Lakes region to eastern markets, that it would make New York City the commercial capital of the continent. He was right. But in 1817, that was not yet obvious. To many observers, the Erie Canal was a preposterous idea. Critics called it Clinton's ditch. They laughed at its ambition. They counted its costs and shook their heads. On the 4th of July, 1817, in the small town of Rome, New York, a man named Canvas White broke ground with a ceremonial shovel, and the work began. That shovel entered the earth at the eastern edge of what would become a great trench, 4 feet deep, 40 feet wide, stretching off toward the western horizon through a wall of dark forest. It would take 8 years to dig it. What happened in those 8 years is one of the great untold stories of American history, not the story of politicians and engineers, though they matter, but the story of the men who swung the axes and drove the plows. The story of the families who followed the work. The story of a new kind of American, born on the edge of a ditch, who would change the country forever. But to understand those people, we must first understand the land they were cutting through. The route of the Erie Canal followed a natural geographic gift, a low, relatively flat corridor across central New York that geologists call the Mohawk Valley and its western extensions. It was a corridor that the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois Confederacy, had known and used for centuries. Their trails ran through this corridor, their trade networks followed it, and their towns had long occupied its most advantageous positions. The Haudenosaunee, the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, Seneca, and Tuscarora nations had already suffered enormously by 1817. The Revolutionary War had torn their confederacy apart, with different nations allied to different sides, and the aftermath had brought wave after wave of settler encroachment on their lands. The Sullivan-Clinton campaign of 1779 had destroyed dozens of their villages. By the time canal workers arrived, much of the Haudenosaunee homeland had been ceded by treaty, often under duress, often through processes that those same nations did not recognize as legitimate. The workers who arrived to dig the canal were entering a landscape that was not empty but was in the process of being made to seem so. The traces of Haudenosaunee civilization, the cleared fields, the worn trails, the named places, were already being absorbed into the settler geography, renamed and reassigned and slowly forgotten. That is a shadow that runs beneath the whole story of the Erie Canal. The highway that would carry a nation westward was built through lands that had already belonged to someone else. But the men with the shovels were not, in general, men who thought about such things. They were men who needed work. They were men who had come from somewhere else, from Ireland, from Germany, from the farms of New England and the docks of New York City, and they were here, in this muddy trench, because the pay was $1 a day, plus room and board, which in 1817 was better than most of them could find anywhere else. They were the first Americans of the canal. But they would not be the last. Part 2, The Diggers, Men in the Trench. Imagine the sound of it, on a summer morning in 1818, somewhere in the flat farmland west of Utica. The sun has barely cleared the tree line. The air smells of wet earth and wood smoke. 100 men are already at work in a trench that is 4 feet deep and wide enough to drive 2 wagons side by side. The sound is rhythmic, relentless, the thud of mattocks striking soil, the scrape of wooden shovels, the groan of oxen pulling loaded scrapers, the distant crack of a tree falling somewhere ahead. These are the diggers. The men at the bottom of everything. They were a remarkably diverse group for their era. The workforce that built the Erie Canal included native-born Americans from New England and New York, farm boys who had heard there was good pay to be had and walked 20 miles to sign on. It included German immigrants who had arrived with strong backs and little English. And increasingly, as the years went on, it included Irish immigrants, men who had come to America with almost nothing and found, in the canal, a kind of rough and temporary home. The Irish workers, in particular, would leave a mark on the canal that went far beyond their labor. Many of them were from the west of Ireland, from counties Mayo and Galway and Clare, where the land was thin and the English landlords were unforgiving. They arrived in New York by the shipload, often in the steerage holds of Atlantic crossings that left them half-starved and wholly bewildered. They came expecting work, and the canal gave it to them: brutal, dangerous, relentlessly physical work, but work that paid, work that could be done by a man with no skills beyond his own body and a willingness to endure. The work camps along the canal route were rough places. Canvas tents, and later crude wooden shanties, stretched along the edge of the trench wherever a section was active. There were hundreds of these camps, moving slowly westward as each section was completed, carrying their populations of workers and cooks and laundresses and hangers-on. Food was substantial if not sophisticated. Workers were typically fed salt pork, cornbread, potatoes, and a local whiskey called Monongahela rye, or simply the ration, which was a daily gill of whiskey provided by the contractors as part of the standard compensation. The whiskey was considered not a luxury but a practical necessity, believed by doctors and workers alike to guard against the fevers and chills that plagued any wet ditch operation. Those fevers were real, and they were deadly. The section of the canal that ran through the Montezuma Marshes, a vast, malarial swamp near the western end of the Finger Lakes, became notorious as the graveyard of the project. In the summer of 1819, a fever epidemic swept through the work camps in that section, killing hundreds of workers in a matter of weeks. Men who had been strong and healthy on Monday were dead by Saturday. The disease was almost certainly malaria, transmitted by the dense clouds of mosquitoes that rose from the standing water. Workers called it the cold plague or simply the sickness. They did not understand its cause. The germ theory of disease was decades away, but they knew that the swamp was killing them, and many simply walked off the job. Those who stayed did so partly because they had no better option, and partly because something harder than economic necessity was at work, a kind of stubborn pride, a refusal to let the swamp win. Benjamin Wright, one of the chief engineers on the project, wrote in his letters about walking through the Montezuma section and finding men working in water up to their chests, digging and scooping mud while shaking with chills. He described the sound of the work camps at night, the coughing, the moaning, the quiet prayers in Irish and German. One of the most significant inventions to come out of the Erie Canal project was hydraulic cement, a type of waterproof mortar that was essential for building the locks and aqueducts. In 1818, a young surveyor named Canvas White discovered that a particular type of limestone found in the Onondaga region of New York, when burned and mixed with water, produced a cement that hardened even underwater. This was a discovery of immense practical value. Before White's cement, American builders had been importing expensive hydraulic cement from Europe. White's discovery, made through patient observation and experimentation in a landscape that most people saw as nothing but swamp and rock, saved the canal project enormous amounts of money and time. There were other inventions too. A wheel-mounted stump puller, designed by local engineers, could uproot a full-grown tree in minutes, work that would have taken a team of men with axes the better part of a day. Specially designed horse-drawn scrapers moved enormous quantities of loose soil. Workers developed new techniques for blasting through limestone ledges with black powder, methods that would later be exported to canal and railroad projects around the world. The Erie Canal was not just a construction project. It was an engineering school. The men who worked on it, the engineers and the diggers both, were developing a body of practical knowledge that had never existed before in America. The men who built the Erie Canal went on to build other canals, railroads, aqueducts, and tunnels across the eastern United States. They carried with them the skills and habits of mind that they had developed in that muddy trench, and they scattered those skills across a continent that was hungry for them. But the diggers themselves received little formal credit. Their names were not written in the histories. The monuments and the speeches honored Clinton and Wright and Geddes. The men with the shovels were buried, when they were buried at all, in unmarked graves along the towpath, their deaths recorded in contractors' ledgers as a line item in the cost of the project. They were not forgotten by everyone, though. The Irish workers, in particular, formed communities along the canal route that persisted long after the construction was done. Towns like Lockport, Brockport, and Jordan in New York have Irish neighborhoods whose roots go back to the canal work camps. The Catholic churches built in those towns in the 1820s and 1830s were built by canal workers or their children, and they still stand. There is a story, repeated in several towns along the canal, though its specific location is disputed, of a group of Irish workers who died in a fever epidemic and were buried together in a field near the towpath, their graves unmarked because no priest was available and no money remained for markers. A century later, workers digging for a different project in the same area uncovered a row of skeletons, dozens of them, laid out in what was clearly a deliberate and careful burial. The bones were old, the clothing fragments were consistent with early 19th century workwear, and the location matched historical records of a fever camp. The community, by then largely descended from different immigrants, unfamiliar with the names and faces of those long-dead workers, took up a collection and gave them proper headstones. It is a small thing, as gestures go. But it is something. On October 26, 1825, 8 years and 2 months after that first ceremonial shovel broke ground in Rome, New York, the Erie Canal was officially complete. DeWitt Clinton, now governor, stepped aboard a boat called the Seneca Chief at Buffalo Harbor, accompanied by 2 barrels of water drawn from Lake Erie. He traveled east along the canal, through one celebration after another, for 10 days, until he reached New York Harbor, where he poured the Lake Erie water into the Atlantic Ocean in a ceremony that was called, with characteristic 19th century grandeur, the Wedding of the Waters. And so the Great Trench became a highway. What lived on that highway next is where our story truly begins. Part 3, The Boats, A World in Motion. Picture the canal on a warm September morning, perhaps in 1835. The light comes slant and golden across the flat fields. The towpath along the south bank is packed dirt, worn smooth by thousands of hooves, and it runs perfectly level, a straight brown line through the green. On the water, barely moving, a canal boat glides forward with a slowness that is almost meditative, its blunt prow pushing a small, quiet wave ahead of it, its painted wooden sides flashing dull red and cream in the morning light. The boat is perhaps 80 feet long, 14 feet wide, and it rides low in the water, heavy with a cargo of wheat from the farms of western New York. At the bow, a young boy no older than 12 stands watching the towpath, one hand resting on a timber post. At the stern, a man in a battered hat steers with a long wooden tiller. Between them, the cabin roof is hung with washing, a woman's dress, a pair of small trousers, a flour sack. On the towpath, 2 mules walk in a slow and steady tandem, their heads down, their hooves raising small puffs of dust. They are connected to the boat by a long rope, a tow line, that runs from their harness back to a low post at the bow. The mules do not hurry. They do not need to. At this pace, 2 to 3 miles per hour, day after day, season after season, they are the most efficient freight movers on the continent. This is the canal boat, and it is a world unto itself. By the 1830s, there were more than 3,000 boats operating on the Erie Canal. The canal had been widened and improved from its original dimensions to accommodate the enormous traffic it was generating. On peak days, boats moved through some sections of the canal in a nearly continuous stream, passing each other at the wide sections, queuing at the locks, creating a floating city that stretched, in some sense, across the entire width of New York State. The boats came in several varieties, designed for different cargoes and different purposes. The most common working boat was the line boat, a large, slow, cargo-focused vessel that carried bulk commodities like grain, flour, salt, lumber, and stone. These were the workhorses of the canal economy. They were owned by individuals or small partnerships, often captained by their owners, and crewed by a minimal number of people, typically a captain, a steersman, a boatman, and a driver for the mules. But the most striking thing about the line boat was that it was not just a vessel. For the families who owned and operated them, it was a home. The stern of a typical line boat contained a cabin that was, by any measure, extremely small, perhaps 12 feet long and 8 feet wide, set below the cargo deck. Within this space, a family might have a cookstove, a table that folded against the wall, 2 or 3 bunks that stacked like shelves, and a small storage area for food and personal belongings. A family of 5 or 6 people lived in this cabin for the entire 7-month navigation season, from the canal's opening in April to its closing in November. They cooked there, slept there, raised their children there, argued and laughed and grieved there. In winter, when ice closed the canal, many boat families wintered in the boat, drawn into a canal-side boatyard, their home simply stopped in place, waiting for spring. Life in the cabin had a rhythm that was dictated entirely by the canal. Wake before dawn. Light the stove. Feed the mules. Set out. Move through the day at that slow, steady, 2-mile-per-hour pace. Stop at a lock. Wait. Move forward. Pull into a canal-side town for provisions, perhaps a stop at the dry goods store, a quick exchange of gossip on the towpath. Move on. At night, the boat might tie up at a designated stopping place. There were hundreds of them along the canal, some formal and some merely a convenient patch of bank, and the family would eat and sleep and rise again before dawn. In addition to line boats, there were packet boats, faster, lighter vessels that carried passengers rather than cargo. The packet boat was the express train of the Erie Canal era. It was pulled by 3 horses instead of mules, and its horses were changed every 10 to 15 miles at relay stations along the towpath. A packet boat could cover 100 miles in 24 hours, remarkable speed for the 1830s, when roads were still largely unpaved. Passengers on the packet boats paid for the relative luxury of travel, a berth in a shared cabin, meals provided by the boat's cook, and the civilized pleasure of moving through the landscape without being jolted to pieces by a stagecoach. The fare from Albany to Buffalo by packet boat in the 1830s was about $4, remarkably cheap compared to the stagecoach alternative, and incomparably more comfortable. A young Abraham Lincoln never traveled the Erie Canal, so far as any record shows, but thousands of men and women who would shape the future of America did. The canal was a kind of moving salon, a place where merchants and lawyers and politicians and reformers shared the close quarters of the packet cabin and talked for hours. Ideas moved along the canal as surely as grain did. Francis Trollope, the English travel writer who wrote so acidly about American manners in the 1830s, described her Erie Canal packet experience with a mixture of reluctant admiration and genteel horror. The landscape, she wrote, was beautiful, sweeping and green and full of light. The accommodations were far less so. The shared sleeping arrangements on the packet boats, women on one side of a thin curtain, men on the other, struck her as a peculiarly American form of enforced democracy. She was not wrong about the democracy part. The Erie Canal was, in a way that few institutions of its era were, genuinely egalitarian, in economics if not in race or gender. A farm boy from Ohio could load his family's surplus grain onto a flatboat in Cleveland, send it along Lake Erie to Buffalo, and from there down the canal to New York City markets, competing in price and quality with any Eastern establishment. The canal lowered the cost of shipping a ton of goods from western New York to New York City from $100 to less than $10. It did not just open the West. It leveled, in a very specific economic sense, a playing field that had always tilted toward the already wealthy. And in its leveling, it created something genuinely new, a class of people who lived on the water, who belonged to the canal, who were neither quite farmers nor quite sailors, who had their own customs and language and codes. They called themselves boatmen. And they were something else entirely. Part 4, The Boatman, a Culture of the Water Road. There is a phrase that was common in the canal towns of New York in the 1830s and 1840s. When someone was particularly rough or reckless, when a man seemed to operate outside the ordinary rules of polite society, people would say, with a mixture of admiration and alarm, that he was a real canalman. The boatmen of the Erie Canal had a reputation. It was, depending on who was speaking, a reputation for toughness, for independence, for generosity in the particular way that people who have little are often generous with what they have. It was also a reputation for drinking, for fighting, for a free use of language that would have cleared a church hall. Both reputations were earned. The world of the Erie Canal boatman was a world of remarkable physical hardship. The work was not the desperate, killing labor of the construction gangs, it was not digging in swamps or blasting through limestone. But it was constant, and it demanded a particular combination of skills that not everyone possessed. And he needed to do all of this while moving, continuously, through landscapes that shifted from the dense forests of central New York to the flat agricultural plains of the Genesee Valley to the dramatic limestone ridge at Lockport, all while maintaining the steady 2 to 4 miles per hour that was the canal's relentless, unhurrying pace. The daily toll of this life was subtle but real. Canal boatmen aged early. The combination of outdoor exposure, irregular meals, physical labor, and the occupational whiskey ration, which had carried over from the construction era as a kind of cultural inheritance, left many boatmen looking a decade older than their actual age. Their hands were perpetually scarred and calloused. Their faces were weathered to the texture of old leather. But they also had something that is hard to name precisely, a quality of presence, a comfort with motion and space and the ongoing uncertainty of weather in cargo and markets, that gave them a particular kind of confidence. The canal-side towns recognized this quality. In the towns along the canal, Syracuse, Utica, Rome, Rochester, Lockport, there were neighborhoods that existed almost entirely to serve the boatmen. Taverns, boarding houses, stables, blacksmiths who specialized in mule shoes, dry goods stores that stocked exactly the provisions a canal family needed. These neighborhoods were rough places, by the standards of respectable 19th-century America. They operated on their own informal rules. Disputes were often settled physically, in yards behind the taverns, watched by crowds of other boatmen. But there was also a code of mutual aid that operated quietly and effectively. A boatman in trouble, a broken boat, a sick mule, an injury, could count on other boatmen for help without being asked. This code was not written anywhere. It did not need to be. It was transmitted through the culture of the canal, passed from experienced hands to new ones, carried in the stories that circulated up and down the water road. The stories were of several kinds. There were practical stories, accounts of particularly treacherous locks, of unusual cargo loads, of notable journeys. There were tall tales, in the American tradition, in which ordinary events were inflated to mythic proportions. And there were ghost stories, which multiplied along the canal in ways that suggest the towpath and the dark water inspired a particular kind of imagination. One persistent legend, circulated along the canal in various forms, concerned a phantom packet boat that supposedly appeared on dark nights, moving west through the locks without a crew, its lantern burning blue rather than yellow. Boatmen who claimed to have seen it disagreed on the details. Some said it was perfectly silent, others that it produced a low sound like a foghorn, but most agreed on its meaning. To see the phantom packet meant that someone in your family would not survive the season. The origin of this story is, of course, impossible to trace. But its persistence suggests something about the psychology of canal life, the way that people who lived with constant, low-level risk translated that risk into narrative, into story, into something that could be passed along and named. Naming a thing makes it smaller. Even a phantom boat on a dark canal. The canal boatmen also had their own songs, a rich musical tradition that developed in the 1820s and flowered in the 1830s and 1840s. Some of these songs were adaptations of earlier folk songs, reshaped to fit the canal experience. Others were original compositions, created on the boats themselves and spread through the informal network of the water road. The most famous of them, the one that every schoolchild in New York State once knew, was called "Low Bridge, Everybody Down." Its melody is simple and almost lullaby-like. Its words describe the life of a boatman named Sal, and his mule named Sal, and the 15 years they've spent together on the Erie Canal. There is something genuinely touching about that song, when you hear it slowly, when you let its words settle. It is a song about a very specific kind of love, the love of a man for his work, for his animal companion, for the particular landscape of a working life. It is not grand or passionate. It is quiet and stubborn and full of a worn-in familiarity. That is, perhaps, the best description of the canal culture itself: quiet, stubborn, worn-in. It was a culture that had its deep shadows too. The canal towns had documented problems with violence, with alcohol, with the exploitation of young workers by unscrupulous contractors. Canal life was hard on bodies and sometimes harder on spirits. The divorce rate among canal families was difficult to calculate. Most separations were informal, unrecorded, but accounts from the era suggest that the strain of confined living, economic uncertainty, and constant movement took a heavy toll on marriages. And beneath all of it ran the question of race, which the canal culture could not escape. The Erie Canal passed through several communities in western New York that were active stations on the Underground Railroad, the network of routes and safe houses that helped enslaved people escape from the South to freedom in the North and Canada. Cities like Rochester and Syracuse were major nodes in this network, and the canal itself was sometimes used as a route, with freedom seekers hidden in the cargo holds of sympathetic boatmen. Frederick Douglass, who had escaped slavery in 1838 and settled in Rochester in 1847, was deeply familiar with the canal community. He wrote about the canal workers of Rochester with a complicated mixture of admiration for their toughness and frustration at their racial prejudice, for the canal culture, for all its democratic mythology, was far from racially equal. Black workers were systematically excluded from the most skilled and well-paid positions on the boats and on the towpath. This is one of the painful truths that lives inside the story of the Erie Canal, and it deserves to be named rather than smoothed over. The canal opened opportunity, but not equally. It opened it for those who were already positioned, by race and by gender, to take advantage. For the women and children of the canal, the story is different still, and different enough to deserve its own telling. Part 5, The Women and Children, Lives Lived in 14 Feet. There is a particular kind of competence that grows from necessity. It is not the competence of training or education. It is something older and quieter than that, the competence of someone who has learned, through years of daily practice, exactly how much a thing weighs, exactly how a rope behaves in wet weather, exactly what a mule's ear position means when it shifts slightly left. The women who lived and worked on the Erie Canal possessed this kind of competence in abundance. Canal life was, in theory, organized around the male captain. He was the nominal owner of the boat, the one who contracted with merchants and paid the tolls and handled the larger negotiations of the trade. But the daily reality of a canal boat was that every adult on board worked constantly, and the division of labor between men and women was far more fluid than it appeared on paper. A canal woman, a boat wife, or sometimes a captain's daughter who had grown up on the water, could steer a fully loaded boat as competently as any man. She could manage the tow line at a lock, coordinate with the lock tender, calculate the weight distribution of a changing cargo. She cooked 3 meals a day on a small iron stove in a cabin that was barely larger than a modern walk-in closet, in all weather, while the boat moved. She also, in most cases, raised children in this environment. This was the fear that shaped the daily lives of canal mothers more than any other. There are records from the era, in diaries and newspaper accounts and letters, of children drowning in the canal, some of them very young, some of them children who had grown up on the boats and knew the water well. The canal was not deep, but it was cold and wide, and a small child who went in unexpectedly could be in serious trouble before anyone on the boat realized what had happened. The response to this risk was practical and ingenious. Many canal families tethered small children to the boat with a length of rope, a short leash, essentially, attached to a simple harness that the child wore around its chest. This was not considered cruel or unusual in the canal community. It was simply prudent. A tethered child who fell into the water could be pulled out immediately. An untethered child might not be. Older children, from about age 7 or 8, were put to work. On most boats, the mule driver was a child. This was one of the most characteristic images of the Erie Canal, a young boy or girl, walking barefoot or in rough leather boots along the towpath, one hand holding the end of the tow line, guiding two mules through mile after mile of the New York countryside. The mule drivers, or hogs, as they were called in canal slang, worked long shifts in all weather. They walked beside their mules in rain and mud, in the cold of early spring and the heat of July, often for 12 or more hours at a stretch. They slept in the mule stable at the bow of the boat when they could, wrapped in straw for warmth. They were some of the youngest workers in a working world, and they were also some of the most experienced. A child who had spent 3 or 4 seasons driving mules on the Erie Canal by age 12 knew things about animals and weather and fatigue and pace that most adults never learned. Their education, in the formal sense, was fragmented and intermittent. Canal children attended school when they could, when the boat was wintered in a town with a school, when a spare week allowed, when a sympathetic teacher was willing to accept a student who would be gone again in a month. The result was a patchwork literacy that varied enormously from family to family. Some canal families placed enormous value on literacy despite the difficulty of acquiring it. Canal boat cabins sometimes contained a surprising number of books, the Bible, of course, but also almanacs, newspapers when they could be gotten, occasional novels. Reading aloud in the cabin on a long evening was one of the primary entertainments of canal family life. Other families were more pragmatic. Reading and writing could wait. The skills that mattered were the skills of the boat. That concern was not always kindly expressed. The respectable classes of the canal towns sometimes regarded canal families, particularly those who stayed on the boats year-round, with a mixture of pity and suspicion. The floating home, the irregular schooling, the rough working habits of the parents, all of it marked canal children as different, as somehow outside the mainstream of the rapidly developing American social order. Canal children absorbed this attitude and, by most accounts, largely ignored it. They had other things to attend to. The world of the canal was, for a child, an extraordinarily rich environment. The canal passed through every kind of landscape that upstate New York had to offer: dense forests, open farmland, limestone gorges, the low flat reaches of the lake plain. It passed through towns of every size, from tiny villages of a few dozen houses to the growing city of Rochester, which was doubling in population every few years on the strength of the canal trade. A canal child who had made the journey from Buffalo to Albany and back had, in a very real sense, seen more of America than most adults of the era. They had watched the landscape change over hundreds of miles. They had met people from dozens of different backgrounds: the German merchants of Buffalo, the Yankee farmers of the Mohawk Valley, the Irish dock workers of Albany. They had heard different accents, eaten different food, observed different customs. This was an education of a kind. It was the education of motion, of the road, of the world as it actually was rather than as the classroom described it. Many canal children, when they grew up, returned to the canal. They became captains and boat wives in their turn, continuing the family tradition of the water road. Others took the broader world knowledge they had gained and applied it elsewhere, in the mills of Rochester, the counting houses of Albany, the rapidly expanding towns of the West that the canal was itself creating. They carried the canal with them wherever they went. Part 6: The Mules, the Real Engines of the Erie. You cannot tell the story of the Erie Canal without telling the story of the mules. They are easy to overlook. They do not appear in the histories. Their names are not recorded in the official documents. But without them, without their particular combination of strength, endurance, and stubbornness, the canal would have been a useless ditch. The mule is a hybrid animal, the offspring of a male donkey and a female horse. This parentage gives it a remarkable set of characteristics that made it ideally suited for towpath work. It is stronger for its size than a horse, more sure-footed on uncertain terrain, more resistant to heat exhaustion, and significantly longer-lived. A well-cared-for mule can work productively for 25 years or more. A horse, doing comparable work, is typically worn out in 10. The mule also has a quality that is often described as stubbornness but is more precisely self-preservation. A horse, overdriven and exhausted, will continue to work until it collapses. It lacks the mechanism to refuse. A mule, by contrast, will simply stop when it has reached its limit. It will stand in the middle of the towpath and decline to move, and no amount of urging will change its position until it has rested. This quality drove inexperienced drivers to fury. It made experienced drivers respect the mule profoundly. On the Erie Canal, mules were the standard towpath animal by the early 1830s, having largely replaced horses on the freight boats. The canal company recognized that mules were more economical, they cost less to feed, they broke down less often, and they lasted longer. A good canal mule, in the 1840s, was worth perhaps $30 to $50, a significant investment, roughly equivalent to several months of a worker's wages. Most freight boats worked 2 mules in rotation, a pair on the towpath at any given time, while a second pair rested in the mule stable at the bow of the boat. The teams were switched at intervals, typically every 4 to 6 hours, so that the animals were never pushed to exhaustion. A well-managed boat with well-managed mules could travel virtually around the clock, covering 60 to 70 miles in a 24-hour period. The care of the mules was one of the most important responsibilities on a canal boat, and it fell to the hogji, the child driver, to execute that care. Feeding, watering, brushing, checking the hooves for stones, inspecting the harnesses for wear, these were daily tasks, performed with the conscientiousness that a child who understood the mule's central importance to the family's livelihood would naturally apply. The relationship between a hogji and the mules in the driver's care was often genuinely affectionate. The long hours of towpath walking, shared in all weather, created a bond that was not unlike the bond between a shepherd and a flock. Children talked to their mules constantly, narrating the passing landscape, sharing grievances, offering encouragement on particularly muddy stretches of towpath. The towline itself was a critical piece of equipment. On a standard canal boat, the towline ran from the mule's harness, over a raised wooden post at the bow of the boat called the snubbing post, and then back along the hull to where it was controlled by the bowman. The length of the towline varied with conditions, longer on straight stretches, shorter through curves and locks, and managing it required constant attention. One of the most common hazards on the canal was the low bridge. The original Erie Canal was crossed by hundreds of bridges, most of them road bridges built to a height of just enough to clear a loaded boat. When a boat was heavily loaded and riding low in the water, these bridges were dangerously close to the roof of the cabin or the heads of anyone standing on the deck. The warning shout, "Low bridge," was one of the most characteristic sounds of the Erie Canal. It was called out by the steersman or the bowman whenever a bridge was approaching, and everyone on deck immediately ducked or lay flat. It appears in songs, in memoirs, in newspaper accounts of the era, a small recurring percussion in the rhythm of canal life. But bridges could also catch the towline. If a line boat was moving at a normal pace and the towline was taut when the bow passed under a bridge, the tow line would catch on the bridge structure and snap taut, jerking the mules backward off the towpath and potentially dragging the boat into the bank. This was one of the most dreaded mishaps on the canal. It happened often enough to be considered a routine hazard, and experienced boatmen developed elaborate routines for approaching bridges with the tow line slackened just so, the mules positioned carefully, the bowman ready to release. The mules themselves seemed to understand the bridge passing maneuver after a few seasons of experience. Experienced animals would slow slightly on their own approaching a bridge, as if calculating the geometry of the situation, and then step forward again once the line was clear. This kind of animal intelligence, steady, practical, accumulated through experience, was the engine that ran the Erie Canal. Not the governor's speeches. Not the engineer's calculations. The slow, regular, 4-beat pace of the mules on the towpath, mile after mile, season after season. When a mule died on the canal, and they did die, of illness and injury and the ordinary attrition of hard work, it was a significant event. It was not merely an economic loss, though it was that too. For the family that had worked with that animal, it was a loss of a companion. Some canal families gave their mules funerals of a brief ceremony, a kind word over the grave, a period of something that looked very much like mourning. The names given to canal mules suggest the affection in which they were held. Not merely Dobbin or Bess, the generic names of the era. Canal mules had names that were specific and particular, Patience, for an animal with an especially equable temperament. Thunder, for one with a tendency to bolt at unexpected sounds. Grace, for a mule so smooth-gaited that it seemed to glide rather than walk. Sally, for the mule in the famous song, though whether any actual mule was named after the song or the song after an actual mule is a question that history has not resolved. They were the real engines of the Erie Canal. Patient, powerful, and, in the end, utterly unreplaceable until the steam engine made them obsolete. But that obsolescence was still decades away. Part 7: The Towns the Canal Built. Consider Rochester, New York, in the year 1817. It is a village of perhaps 1,500 people, perched at the falls of the Genesee River, notable primarily for its mills and its mud. The roads leading to it are rough in summer and impassable in winter. It exports almost nothing, because the cost of getting anything out is prohibitive. Now consider Rochester in 1840. It is the fastest growing city in the United States. Its population has reached 20,000. It has flour mills and textile mills and machine shops and bookstores and hotels and a newspaper. It exports more flour, per year, than any other city in the world. Its docks along the canal are stacked with barrels and crates waiting for passage east. Its streets are busy from before dawn to after dark. The difference between those two Rochesters, separated by only 23 years, is the Erie Canal. This is the story of the canal's effect on the towns it passed through, and it is a story of transformation so rapid that contemporaries struggle to find language for it. Americans of the early 19th century were accustomed to change. Their country was young and growing, perpetually in the process of becoming something it had not been before. But the speed of the canal's effect on the towns along its route still astonished observers. The basic mechanism was simple. The canal made it cheap to move goods. When it became cheap to move goods, it made sense to produce goods in large quantities. When it made sense to produce goods in large quantities, mills and factories appeared. When mills and factories appeared, workers came. When workers came, they needed food and clothing and shelter and entertainment. All of this created more commerce, which created more prosperity, which attracted more investment, which brought more industry. It was an economic spiral that lifted every town along the canal's route, though not equally, and not without complications. Syracuse, which sat astride one of the richest salt deposits in North America, became a major industrial city on the strength of the canal, which made it possible to ship salt in enormous quantities to the markets of the East. Salt, that most fundamental of preservatives, the substance without which food could not be stored, without which the preservation of pork and beef through winter was impossible, had been produced in the Onondaga Lake region for centuries. The Onondaga Nation had known about the brine springs there long before any European settler arrived. The canal made the salt industry industrial. By the 1840s, the salt works around Syracuse were producing millions of bushels of salt annually, employing thousands of workers, and generating revenues that made the city wealthy. The Irish workers who had first come to the canal as construction laborers stayed on in Syracuse, working the salt boilers and the docks, building a community that would persist for generations. Utica, at the eastern end of the canal's central section, became a center of textile manufacturing. The combination of water power from the rivers, cotton shipped cheaply from the south via New York City and then up the Hudson and along the canal, and a large workforce of women willing to work in the mills created an industry that, in its own way, echoed the great mill towns of New England. Buffalo, at the western terminus of the canal, underwent perhaps the most dramatic transformation of all. In 1820, it was a small frontier town, still recovering from its burning by the British during the War of 1812. By 1840, it was one of the most important commercial cities in America, the point where the Great Lakes met the canal, where the produce of the Ohio Valley and the upper Midwest was transferred from lake schooners to canal boats for the journey east. Lockport, named for the flight of 5 combined locks that managed the dramatic elevation change at the Niagara Escarpment, was created by the canal almost from nothing. Before the canal, there was nothing at the site but a limestone ridge. After the canal, there was a town because the locks required workers, workers required services, and services attracted more people. The construction of the Lockport locks was itself one of the great engineering achievements of the canal project. The escarpment rose almost 70 feet at that point, and the canal's engineers solved the problem with a double set of 5 combined locks, each one raising or lowering the boat approximately 12 feet, the 5 locks together managing the full vertical rise. The 2 parallel sets allowed traffic to move in both directions simultaneously. But the towns of the canal were not simply economic entities. They were cultural ones too, and the culture they created was something genuinely new in American life. The canal towns of western New York became, in the 1830s and 1840s, some of the most religiously and socially fervent places in America. The region was called, by the great revivalist Charles Finney, the burned-over district, a landscape so thoroughly swept by successive waves of religious revival that it was, he said, like a field that had been burned and burned again until nothing was left to ignite. The metaphor was vivid but not entirely accurate. What the canal had created in western New York was not a landscape exhausted by religion but one electrified by it. The combination of rapid growth, social disruption, the mixing of people from different backgrounds, and the particular psychological effects of the frontier, the sense of possibility, of things not yet settled, of a world still in the making, created conditions in which new religious and social ideas took root with extraordinary speed. The Mormons, the Millwrights, the Spiritualists. The various utopian communities that dotted the landscape of western New York in the 1830s and 1840s, the Oneida Community, the Shakers of New Lebanon, the various Fourierist phalanxes that attempted to create ideal social arrangements in the new agricultural landscape, all of them emerged from this canal country. And alongside them, the great reform movements of the era: abolitionism, women's suffrage, temperance. The Erie Canal carried not just grain and timber but ideas, radical ones, world-changing ones. The women's rights movement was, in a real sense, born in a canal town. Seneca Falls, New York, sitting on the route of a branch canal, connected to the Erie network, was the site of the first women's rights convention in 1848, organized by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott. The Declaration of Sentiments produced at Seneca Falls, which declared that all men and women are created equal, was written in a country that the canal had opened. None of this is accidental. The canal had created a world of rapid change and heightened possibility. In such a world, questions about who got to participate in that possibility, who counted as a full member of the new American order, became urgent and unavoidable. Part 8: Commerce, Conflict, and the Canal's Golden Age. By the mid-1840s, the Erie Canal was carrying more freight than any other waterway in the world. Let that settle for a moment. The world had rivers and harbors and ocean lanes that had been in use for centuries. The Thames, the Seine, the Rhine, the Mississippi. And a 40-foot wide ditch across upstate New York was outpacing all of them. The numbers are remarkable. In 1845, the canal carried more than 1 million tons of freight. The revenue from tolls on that freight was nearly $2 million, sufficient to pay off the entire original construction debt of the canal several times over. New York State had invested approximately $7 million to build the Erie Canal. By 1845, it had collected more than $40 million in tolls. The economic effect on New York City was transformative. Before the canal, New York was one of several competing Atlantic ports. After the canal, it was in a category of its own. The vast agricultural and extractive wealth of the Great Lakes Basin, grain, timber, furs, copper from the newly opened Lake Superior mines, all of it poured east along the canal and into New York Harbor, making the city not just the commercial capital of America but one of the great commercial cities of the world. The cost of moving a ton of goods from Buffalo to New York City, which had been about $100 by road before the canal, had fallen to about $3 by 1840. This was not just a convenience. It was a revolution. It meant that a farmer in Ohio who could ship his grain across Lake Erie to Buffalo, and from there along the canal to New York, could now compete in world markets. American wheat began to appear in British markets. American flour undersold European competitors in South American ports. The canal's impact on American agriculture cannot be overstated. It opened the entire Great Lakes Basin, ultimately stretching west to Minnesota and north to Ontario, to world markets. It made the Midwest the breadbasket of the world. It set in motion a wave of agricultural settlement that would continue for generations, as families from the East and from Europe moved west in search of the cheap, fertile land that canal access had made commercially viable. But this golden age was not without its tensions. The relationship between the Boatmen and the Canal Commission was frequently contentious. Toll rates were a perpetual source of grievance. The Commission set different rates for different types of cargo, in a system that was intended to be fair but was, in practice, complex enough to be manipulated by anyone with the knowledge and connections to do so. Large commercial operators, the packet boat companies, the line boat companies that operated fleets of dozens of boats rather than individual craft could negotiate favorable arrangements with the Commission and achieve economies of scale that individual owner-operators could not match. The 1830s and 1840s saw the gradual consolidation of canal trade into fewer, larger hands, as small operators found themselves squeezed between the toll rates and the prices offered by the grain merchants at either end. There was violence too, of a kind that the canal's peaceable image tends to obscure. Competition for cargo at the loading points was fierce. There were established norms about who had priority at a dock or at a merchant's warehouse. First come, first served was the general principle, but enforcing those norms in the chaotic environment of a busy canal-side town often came down to physical confrontation. Fights between boat crews competing for cargo were common enough to be remarked upon only when they were unusually serious. There was also conflict with the canal's neighbors. The towpath ran along the edge of farms and through settled communities, and the constant traffic of mules and workers and itinerant laborers created friction with the settled population. Mules ate crops when they could. Workers occasionally helped themselves to things that were not theirs. The canal brought prosperity, but it brought disruption too, and not everyone along the route was grateful for it. The canal also created a significant problem of water management. The artificial waterway altered the drainage patterns of the landscape it crossed, flooding some areas that had been dry and drying others that had been wet. Farmers along the route found their fields flooded, their wells affected, their roads disrupted by the construction and maintenance of the canal bank. The state addressed some of these complaints through a system of damage payments, but the process was slow and the settlements were often inadequate. The legal history of the Erie Canal is full of damage claims, farmers suing the state for flooded fields, millers suing for diverted water, landowners suing for land taken without adequate compensation. And then there was the deeper, slower conflict, the conflict with the railroads. The first railroad in New York State, the Mohawk and Hudson, opened in 1831, 6 years after the Erie Canal was completed. It covered 17 miles, between Albany and Schenectady, and it was a novelty, a curiosity, a demonstration that iron rails and steam power could move passengers with a speed that neither canal boats nor stagecoaches could match. The canal community did not take it seriously, at first. The early railroads were noisy, unreliable, and prone to spectacular accidents. They were fine for passengers, perhaps, but for freight, for the heavy, slow-moving bulk cargoes that were the economic foundation of the canal, they seemed to offer little advantage. The cost of moving freight by rail was, in the 1830s, substantially higher than by canal. The canal had the advantage of infrastructure already built, already paid for, already integrated into the commercial life of the state. But the railroad was improving, year by year, decade by decade. By the 1840s, it was clear that the railroad was not a novelty but a revolution, one that would, in time, transform transportation as fundamentally as the canal had done. The enlargement was enormously expensive, more than $50 million over its full course, and it was beset by political disputes, engineering controversies, and the boom and bust cycles of the era's economy. Construction stopped during the financial crisis of 1837, started again, stopped again. Workers who had signed on for the expansion found themselves laid off without warning when funding ran dry. But the enlarged canal, when it was operating, was a formidable commercial machine. In its peak years of the 1850s and 1860s, it carried more freight than ever before, more, even, than the growing railroad network could handle. The canal and the railroad coexisted, uneasily, for decades. Each had its advantages. The railroad was faster for passengers and light goods. The canal was cheaper for bulk freight, grain, coal, timber. New York State navigated this competition by becoming the home of both the great trunk railroads of the mid-19th century. The New York Central, above all, ran largely parallel to the canal, connecting the same cities, serving the same markets, but serving them differently. For the boatmen and their families, the railroad was a threatening presence but not yet a fatal one. The canal still had its trade. The mules still walked the towpath. The boats still slid through the locks at Lockport in Rome and Troy. But the change was coming. Part 9: The Rhythms of the Seasons. A Year on the Canal. There is a clock that runs through the story of the Erie Canal that has nothing to do with railroad timetables or commercial competition. It is the clock of the seasons. The canal was a seasonal waterway. Ice closed it in November and held it locked through the deep cold of a New York winter. Navigation opened again, traditionally, on April 1st, a date celebrated along the canal with something approaching a regional festival. The opening day of navigation, as it was formally called, was one of the great ritual moments of the canal year. Weeks before it, the canal-side towns were already stirring with preparation. Boat families who had wintered in the boatyards were refitting their vessels, caulking seams, painting hulls, repairing cabin woodwork, replacing worn sections of towline, seeing to the mules' hooves and shoes after months of relative idleness. The winter months on the canal were a time of enforced stillness that the canal community experienced in different ways. Some families found the winter months peaceful, a chance to rest, to attend to the children's schooling, to visit relatives on shore, to repair the thousand small damages that the working season inflicted on a boat and its equipment. Others found the stillness difficult. Canal people were people of motion, people for whom the regular, rhythmic forward progress of the boat through the landscape was the background music of their lives. The silence of the ice-locked winter could feel, to those accustomed to constant movement, like a kind of imprisonment. There is a particular phrase that appeared in several diaries and letters from canal families describing the period just before the opening of navigation. They described the smell of spring as something almost physical, the smell of cold water loosening, of mud thawing, of the first green things pushing through the banks. They describe a feeling of impatience that is almost bodily, a restlessness in the hands and feet. And then, in early April, the ice broke and the canal opened, and the boats moved again. The spring journey from Buffalo to Albany or from Albany to Buffalo was the first of the season's two great passages, and it had its own particular quality. The landscape along the canal in early April was not yet full spring, the trees were barely budded, the fields still brown from winter, the air cold enough for breath to cloud. But there was light, and there was motion, and there was the immensely satisfying sense of the season beginning again. The spring cargoes moving east were primarily grain, the winter wheat and stored corn that had accumulated in the elevator warehouses of Buffalo and the smaller western ports through the winter. Moving west, the boats carried dry goods, hardware, manufactured items, immigrants. The immigrants deserve particular attention. The Erie Canal was, for much of its active life, the primary highway of westward migration. The great wave of immigration that transformed the United States in the mid-19th century, Germans fleeing the failed revolutions of 1848, Irish fleeing the famine of 1845 to 1852, Scandinavians, Dutch, Bohemians, all of them drawn by the promise of American land and opportunity, poured through New York Harbor and then, almost universally, took the canal west. The experience of canal travel for these immigrants was often their first extended encounter with America after the initial chaos of arrival in New York City. The slow pace of the canal gave them time to see the country they had come to observe its landscapes and its people, to begin the long process of becoming American. Some of them wrote about this experience. The letters and diaries of German immigrants, in particular, frequently describe the Erie Canal journey with a combination of wonder and practical assessment. The landscape was beautiful, they wrote, broader and flatter and greener than Germany, in ways that felt either liberating or disorienting depending on the writer's disposition. The Americans they encountered on the boats and in the canal-side towns were friendly but strange, loud, informal, curiously indifferent to social hierarchy. They were also struck by the sheer abundance. The grain that filled the boats going east, the timber that floated in vast rafts down the connecting rivers, the ease with which ordinary families seemed to eat, all of it spoke of a land that was genuinely different from the one they had left. Many of these immigrants settled along the canal route itself rather than continuing further west. The canal towns needed workers for the mills, for the factories, for the construction work that the endless expansion of the American economy seemed to require. The German community of Rochester, the Irish community of Syracuse, the Welsh community and the slate quarrying towns to the north, all of them grew out of the immigration stream that the canal carried. Summer on the canal was the height of the season, the peak of traffic, the fullest barrels of toll revenue, the busiest docks. The summer cargoes were diverse, the new wheat and corn coming in from the farms, lumber from the forests of the Adirondacks and the Great Lakes Basin, stone from the quarries of Lockport and Medina, salt from the Syracuse works. The summer days were long, and the boats ran them nearly all the way through. A night passage on the Erie Canal in July was something that travelers described with consistent wonder, the quiet darkness of the countryside, broken by the occasional light of a farmhouse window or the brighter lights of a canal-side town. The towpath stretched away into the dark, the mules visible as dark shapes against the lighter road, their hooves making a rhythmic soft sound that carried across the water. The towns through which the canal passed were alive on summer evenings in ways that rural America rarely was. The canal-side taverns were full, their windows bright. Fiddle music drifted out over the water. The smell of cooking, salt pork and cornbread, but also the more interesting smells of a dozen immigrant cuisines mixing together in the cramped kitchens of the canal neighborhoods, hung in the warm air. At the locks, especially in summer, there was always a small gathering of locals who had come simply to watch. The locking through of a fully loaded boat was a satisfying piece of mechanical theater, the gates swinging open on their massive wooden hinges, the water rushing in or draining out with a deep, churning sound, the boat rising or falling in the stone chamber like something alive. Children perched on the lock walls and watched with total absorption. Old men sat on benches nearby, smoking their pipes and commenting on the boats that passed. Lock tenders were figures of significant local importance. They lived in small stone houses built at the lock sites, and they were there at all hours. The canal traffic did not stop for night or weather, and neither did the lock tender's duty. A lock tender who managed his lock well, who kept the gates in good repair, who logged the boats passing through accurately, who managed the inevitable conflicts between boats competing to be first through a busy lock, was a valued member of the canal community. The lock tender's ledger was, in its way, one of the great documents of canal social history. Every boat that passed through was recorded, its name, its captain, its cargo, its destination. Looking through the surviving lock tender ledgers from the Erie Canal, and some of them do survive, in archives in Albany and Rochester and Utica, is like watching the canal's traffic flow past in slow motion, the same boats appearing week after week, the patterns of the trade visible in the repeated entries, the individual lives of the boatmen implied in the regularity of their passages. Autumn on the canal had a quality all its own. The harvest season brought the heaviest freight loads of the year, the new grain crop, the apples from the orchards of the Genesee Valley, the last lumber loads before the forests became difficult to work. The boats rode deep in the water, heavy with cargo, moving more slowly than at any other time of year. The autumn light in central New York is famously golden clear, the sky a particular blue that seems to deepen in October, the trees along the canal banks burning with color. Against this backdrop, the slow procession of the loaded boats, the mules on the towpath, the smoke rising from the cabin stoves, because the nights were cold now, and the stoves ran nearly all the time, had a quality that even contemporary observers recognized as something worth recording. The painters of the Hudson River School, who were making American landscape painting into a serious art form in exactly these decades, did not paint the Erie Canal very often. They preferred the grander scenery of the Catskills and the Adirondacks. But a few canvases survive that show the canal in its autumn aspect, and they carry in them something of what it felt like, the particular combination of human industry and natural beauty that was the canal's defining quality. The last boats of the season made their way to the canal-side boatyards in the final days of November, pulling in beside their neighbors, the lines made fast, the cabin stoves reduced to minimal heat. The canal was over for another year. And the long winter wait began again. Part 10, The Great Characters, Legends of the Water Road. Every world that has existed long enough develops its legends. The Erie Canal was no different. The canal produced characters of the kind that a democratic, mobile, hard-working society tends to produce, people whose particular combination of talent, luck, and force of personality made them larger than the ordinary run of canal life, whose stories circulated along the water road and took on the quality of folktales even while the people themselves were still living. Some of these characters were real people whose genuine lives were remarkable enough to require no embellishment. Others were partly real and partly mythologized, their actual histories overlaid with a layer of legend that made them more vivid and more useful to the culture that told their stories. And some were purely invented, characters created to carry specific values or anxieties that the canal community needed to explore. Among the real characters, few were more colorful than the self-styled captains of the Albany Buffalo Packet Run, the men who commanded the passenger boats and competed fiercely for the trade of travelers who wanted speed and relative comfort. These men understood that their reputation for reliability and civility was their commercial advantage, and they cultivated it with a showman's instinct. One of the most celebrated was a captain named Levi Thayer, who operated a packet on the central section of the canal in the 1840s. Thayer was known for the extraordinary quality of the meals served on his boat, this in an era when packet boat cooking was generally regarded as barely edible, and for his personal habit of standing at the bow in all weather, wearing an enormous beaver hat, greeting passengers and bystanders along the route by name. He knew, apparently, the name of nearly every lock tender, toll collector, and canal-side tavern keeper on his route, and he called out to each of them as he passed. This was not merely sociability. It was competitive intelligence. A captain who knew everyone knew everything, knew which merchants were looking for space on westbound boats, knew which farmers had a good harvest coming, knew which locks were running slow and which taverns had been closed by the authorities for disorder. In the pre-telegraph world of the canal, this kind of personal network was as valuable as any commercial arrangement. Among the women of the canal, one name that appears repeatedly in the accounts of the era is that of a woman identified in most sources only as Widow Granger, a canal boat captain from the Rochester area who took over her husband's boat and business after his death in the mid-1840s and ran it, successfully and profitably, for the next 15 years. Widow Granger, her first name does not appear in the surviving records, which is itself a comment on the historical record's attitude toward women, was described by a traveling journalist who encountered her at a lock near Brockport as a small, very brown woman with the hands of a man twice her size and an entirely calm manner of authority. Her crew, the journalist reported, obeyed her without question and spoke of her with evident admiration. She was not unique. There were other women who captained boats on the canal, widows who had inherited the business, daughters who had grown up on the water and never left, women whose husbands' illnesses or injuries had made their own full competence necessary. But she was visible enough, and distinctive enough, that she made it into the record. The canal also produced its memorable villains. Theft was an endemic problem on the canal, theft of cargo, primarily, but also theft of the mules and horses that represented such significant investments, and theft from the passengers on the packet boats. The close quarters of canal travel created opportunities for the light-fingered that were difficult to police effectively. The Canal Commission employed a small force of inspectors whose job included investigating cargo theft, but the commission was chronically underfunded and the inspectors were too few to cover 360 miles of waterway effectively. Most theft was handled informally, through the social mechanisms of the canal community, the network of relationships that meant that a known thief quickly found himself unable to do business along the canal, unable to load at any dock or stay at any canalside inn. There was a man identified in the court records of Oneida County as Joseph Kirby, though he appears in various canal tales under various names, who developed in the 1840s a system of cargo fraud that was sophisticated for its era. His method was to accept large contracts for delivering cargo from western ports to Albany, take the cargo, and then offload it at an intermediate point, replacing it with rocks or sand to keep the boat riding at the correct depth. He would then proceed to Albany and claim that the cargo had been damaged or stolen in transit. He ran this scheme successfully, by various accounts, for 2 or 3 years before a sharp-eyed toll collector at a lock near Utica noticed that the manifest for a particular boat claimed a cargo of flour that seemed inconsistent with the boat's trim and the water. The subsequent inspection revealed bags of sand where the flour barrels should have been. Kirby, or whatever his actual name was arrested, tried, and sentenced to a term in the state prison. The story circulated along the canal for years afterward, growing with each telling. In the most elaborated versions, the fraudster had run the scheme for a decade and defrauded every major merchant house in New York State. In the more reliable versions, he was a small-time operator who had enjoyed a modest run of luck before being caught by a lock tender with an eye for numbers. Both versions served a purpose. They reminded canal workers and merchants alike that the system could be gamed, that trust was essential but not infallible, that the person you were doing business with needed to be watched. The canal's most enduring legendary character, though, was not a fraudster or a captain or a celebrated widow. It was the hogji, the mule driver, the canal child, in a particular form that the culture had mythologized into something approaching a folk hero. In the oral tradition of the canal, the ideal hogji was a child, usually a boy, in the stories, though in reality the work was done by children of both sexes, who was small, dirt poor, and apparently without prospects, but who possessed some remarkable quality, an uncanny ability with mules, a directional memory that never failed, an instinct for weather that saved boats from sudden storms. The hogji of the stories was someone who seemed to belong to the canal in a way that even the most experienced adult did not, someone for whom the towpath was as natural and comfortable as a living room floor. This character, repeated in various forms in the songs and stories of the canal, carried something important. It said, "This world has a place for people who start with nothing." It said, "What matters here is not what you were born with but what you learn to do." It said, The canal is democratic not just in theory but in practice, and the child walking barefoot beside the mules is as much a part of this world as the merchant counting his profits in Albany. Whether or not this was literally true, and we have seen that it was, in many ways, not, it was what the canal culture needed to believe about itself. And like all necessary myths, it carried a grain of truth inside it. There were children who started as hogs and ended as captains. There were men and women who arrived on the canal with nothing and built lives of modest but real prosperity. The canal was not a perfect meritocracy, but it was more fluid and more forgiving of beginnings than most of the social structures it ran alongside. That is worth something. It is not everything, but it is something. Part 11, The Long Decline, When the Water Road Grew Quiet. There is something melancholy about the final decades of the Erie Canal's working life, something that the historians tend to hurry past in their rush toward the more dramatic stories of construction and Golden Age. But the decline deserves its own slow attention, because it contains truths about change and loss that are as human and as universal as anything in the canal's more celebrated chapters. The beginning of the end was not a single event. It was a gradual shift, almost imperceptible at first, like the slow fading of light on a long autumn afternoon. The railroads were the primary agent of that shift. In the 1850s, the series of small railroad companies that ran parallel to the Erie Canal began to consolidate into the organization that would become the New York Central Railroad, a continuous rail line from Albany to Buffalo, following almost exactly the route of the canal. By 1853, the New York Central could carry a passenger from Albany to Buffalo in less than 12 hours. The canal took 4 or 5 days. For passengers, the choice was obvious, and by the late 1850s the passenger packet boat was effectively dead. The railroad had taken the passenger trade completely. The great packet boats, the ones that had once carried politicians and reformers and immigrants in their crowded cabins, were repurposed or broken up or simply left to rot at their moorings. Freight was slower to shift. The canal held its freight advantage through the 1860s and into the 1870s, because the cost per ton-mile by canal remained lower than by rail for bulk commodities. Grain, coal, and timber still moved more cheaply by water. But the railroads were improving their efficiency steadily, and the gap was narrowing. By the 1880s, the New York Central had developed systems for handling bulk grain freight by rail that matched the canal's cost advantage for many shippers. And the railroad offered what the canal could not: year-round service. The closing of the canal in November had always been a limitation. For merchants who needed reliable, continuous supply chains, the 5 months of winter closure were a significant inconvenience. The railroad, which ran through winter without interruption, carrying freight by a slightly more expensive but perfectly reliable service, became increasingly attractive to those merchants as the century advanced. The effect on the canal community was slow but devastating. Boats that had been running profitably found their margins thinning. Captains who had made a comfortable living from the freight trade found themselves competing more fiercely for a declining pool of cargo. The great canal-side warehouses, which had once been packed to their rafters with goods waiting for the next boat east, began to empty. The people felt it before the numbers showed it. There are letters from canal boatmen written in the 1870s and 1880s that have a quality of weariness that is different from the ordinary exhaustion of the working life. They describe the towpaths as quieter than they used to be. They note that the canal-side taverns are less full, that the great grain elevators of Buffalo are sending more of their product by rail, that the merchants who used to compete for canal space are now booking railroad cars instead. One letter, written by a canal captain named Erasmus Hartwell to his brother in 1876, says simply, "The road is getting lonesome." That phrase, "the road is getting lonesome," carries in its 7 words the entire weight of a world in decline. The canal community responded to this challenge in various ways. Some boatmen sought out the niches where the canal still had an advantage: the local trade between nearby canal-side towns, the carriage of heavy stone and gravel for construction, the transport of industrial materials that were too heavy and too cheap to bear railroad freight rates. These niches were real, and they kept the canal in commercial operation for longer than the grand narrative of railroad triumph might suggest. Others left the canal entirely. The children and grandchildren of the great canal families, those who had grown up on the boats in the 1850s and 1860s, who had learned the towpath as their first landscape, found themselves in a world that no longer needed what they knew. Some went to the railroads. Some went to the cities. Some went west, following the movement of the frontier that the canal had itself helped set in motion. The physical landscape of the canal changed too, as the decline advanced. Sections that had been kept scrupulously maintained in the canal's peak years began to show wear. Lock gates that needed replacement were repaired with inferior materials. Towpaths that had once been packed hard by the constant passage of mule hooves softened and grew weedy at the edges. The stone coping of the canal banks, once tight and regular, began to shift and crack. The canal towns themselves adapted, as canal towns had always adapted, to changing circumstances. Rochester, which had built its fortune on the canal, had long since diversified. Its manufacturing base was broad enough by the 1870s and 1880s that the decline of the canal was a blow but not a fatal one. It survived and continued to grow, driven by industries: optical equipment, photography equipment, the beginnings of what would become Kodak, that had nothing to do with the water road. Smaller towns fared less well. The canal-side villages that had existed primarily as service stops, places where boats could take on provisions, where mule teams could be exchanged, where boatmen could sleep indoors, found themselves losing their reason for existence. The taverns closed. The stables emptied. The dry goods stores that had specialized in canal provisions converted to more general trades or closed. There was a particular kind of silence that settled over these places as the canal traffic diminished. The quiet of a place that had been built for noise and motion and was now emptying out. It is a silence that anyone who has lived in a post-industrial town knows, the specific quality of a place that was once purposeful and is now waiting for a purpose that may not come. In 1882, New York State abolished the collection of canal tolls. This was intended as a stimulus, a way to make the canal more competitive with the railroads by reducing the cost of canal transport to zero. The tolls had been the canal's revenue stream, but they had also been its competitive disadvantage. By eliminating them, the state hoped to bring traffic back to the water road. It helped, somewhat, in the short term. Canal traffic picked up slightly in the 1880s. But the fundamental equation had not changed. The railroad was faster, more reliable, more flexible. The canal, even free, could not match it for most purposes. By the 1890s, the Erie Canal carried perhaps a quarter of the freight it had carried in its peak years. The great fleet of working boats had shrunk dramatically. The boat-building yards that had once been among the most active industrial sites in upstate New York were shuttered or repurposed. The mule-shoeing blacksmiths had mostly closed or turned to other work. The people who remained on the canal in these final commercial decades were, in many ways, the most deeply rooted of all the canal's communities, people for whom the water road was not just a livelihood but an identity, who could not or would not imagine themselves elsewhere. They stayed as the traffic thinned, as the seasons grew quieter, as the old rhythms became slower and more intermittent. They stayed until the state made a decision that changed everything. The barge canal was completed in 1918. And with its opening, the original Erie Canal, the canal that DeWitt Clinton had championed and the diggers had built with their hands and the boatmen had made their home, ceased to exist as a commercial waterway. The world of the boats and the mules and the families on the water was over. Or almost over. Part 12. What remains, the canal in memory and landscape. Stand on the towpath at Medina, New York, on a morning in October, and you will feel something that is difficult to name precisely. The canal is still there, at Medina. Or rather, a canal is still there. The Erie Canal is rebuilt and modernized, the New York State canal system that carries recreational boaters and the occasional commercial barge, maintained by the state, quiet in the early morning light. The stone walls of the original canal are visible in places, their courses of dressed limestone tight and regular even after 2 centuries of weather. The lock houses, some of them, still stand, small stone buildings with thick walls and wide chimneys, empty now but built to last. The towpath has been converted in many sections to a recreational trail, and people walk and cycle it in the seasons when the weather permits, moving at a pace that is, interestingly, not so very different from the pace of the mules. What the landscape of the canal holds is memory in the most physical sense, memory encoded in stone and earthwork, in the shape of the land, in the names of the places that the canal created or transformed. Rochester's inner neighborhoods still carry the geography of the canal era, the street patterns that developed around the old basin, the warehouse districts that have been converted to apartments and galleries, the names that remain: Canal Street, Lock Street, Towpath Road, even when the physical reality they described has been paved over or filled in. In Herkimer and Little Falls and Canajoharie, small museums preserve the artifacts of canal life, the boat models, the carpenter's tools, the toll collection ledgers, the domestic objects from the cabins, the small iron cookstoves, the folding tables, the quilts made in the close quarters of the stern cabin during winter months. Looking at these objects, you feel their specific human weight, the quilt particularly, its patches cut from old clothing, its stitching tight and even, made by hands that had also steered a boat through a November fog. The songs have survived too, which is perhaps the most remarkable thing. Low Bridge, Everybody Down, or the Erie Canal Song, as it is sometimes called, was written in 1905 by Thomas S. Allen, a Tin Pan Alley songwriter who had grown up in upstate New York and had actual memories of the working canal. It was written as the canal era was ending, as a kind of fond memorial to a world that was passing. And yet it became something more than a memorial. It became the thing itself, or rather, it became the vessel into which a culture poured the memories it most needed to keep. The slow and singing rhythm of the song, its easy affection for the mule and the man and the particular landscape of that water road, has kept something alive that might otherwise have been entirely lost. Children in New York State still learn it. Adults who grew up in the canal country sing it with a feeling that is somewhere between nostalgia and recognition of something they were not personally present for but that nonetheless feels like memory. This is what culture does with its deepest losses, it turns them into song. The historical scholarship on the Erie Canal has, in recent decades, begun to recover the full complexity of the canal's history, not just the engineering achievement and the economic triumph, but the human costs, the racial exclusions, the displacement of the Haudenosaunee, the suffering of the construction workers, the difficult lives of the women and children on the boats. This recovery is important and ongoing. The canal was genuinely transformative, genuinely remarkable, and it was also a product of its era, which means it carried the injustices and inequalities of that era as surely as it carried grain and timber. Both things are true. They need not cancel each other out. The boatman who sang on his towpath in 1845, proud of his route and his mule and his knowledge of the water road, he was real, and his pride was real, and his world had genuine value. So was the Onondaga elder who watched the canal cut through land his people had used for centuries, and felt the particular grief of a dispossession that was legal on paper and unjust in fact. History does not resolve these tensions. It holds them. And in holding them, it offers us something more useful than a simple story of triumph or a simple story of loss. It offers us the complicated truth. It is the story of the Hogji walking barefoot on the towpath at dawn, the rope in one hand, the mules moving ahead, the water beside them still and silver in the early light. It is the story of a woman in a stern cabin, stirring something on a small iron stove, one ear on the children, one ear on the sound of the water against the hull, listening for the slight change in the boat's motion that means a lock is approaching. It is the story of a digger from County Mayo who spent 3 years in a trench and is buried, unmarked, near a towpath that still exists, in a state that still bears the shape of what he built. It is the story of two mules named Sal, walking west in the October light, their heads down, their pace steady, the world moving slowly past them in the way that the world moves when you have all the time you need. That world is gone. The boats are gone, the mule teams are gone, the packet captains and the lock tenders and the hogs in their worn leather boots. But the water is still there. Moving slowly east through the flat autumn country. Carrying nothing now but its own weight and the memory of everything that once floated on it. That is enough. Closing meditation. Let the images settle now, like silt settling to the bottom of still water. The canal is quiet tonight. The towpath is empty. The mules are long since resting, in whatever field it is that patient animals go to at last. Somewhere along 363 miles of slow water, a lantern still burns. Or something like a lantern. The memory of orange light on dark water. The memory of a rope going taut in the gray morning, and two animals stepping forward, and a loaded boat beginning, slowly, to move. You are very still now. Your body has settled into the weight of sleep. Your breathing has found its own slow rhythm, quieter than the canal, quieter than the hooves on the towpath, quieter than the water moving through the locks. Think, if you like, of the stone walls of a lock. How they were cut by hand, 200 years ago. How they hold the water still. How they will hold it long after everyone now living has gone. Think of the families in their cabins, the lamp burning low, the children asleep in the bunks. The stove ticking as it cools. The boat rocking almost imperceptibly in the dark water. The mules at rest in their straw. You are resting too. The canal is a long, slow breath held across the landscape. East to west, from the river to the lake, from the old world to the new one. You can follow it in your mind without hurrying, the Mohawk Valley opening wide and flat, the limestone escarpment at Lockport, the flat lake plain stretching out toward Buffalo, the smell of fresh water and cut stone and the distant, always distant, smell of the lake itself. Let your eyes close all the way now. The water is still. The night is long. The towpath stretches away into the dark, and somewhere along it a child is walking beside two mules, not in any hurry, going nowhere that needs to be reached tonight. You can rest now. The canal will be there in the morning. Everything can wait until morning. Sleep well. If you're still awake, that's okay. Just close your eyes and let the story carry you. Subscribe to History for Sleep for a new story every week. Sweet dreams.